Welcome back to the deep dive. This is where we take, well, a whole stack of sources, articles, research, and our own notes, and we try to pull out the most important nuggets of knowledge. The goal: to make you instantly well informed. Today, we're heading out on a really fascinating journey. It's one that honestly goes way beyond just studying a religion. We're getting into a profound intellectual and social transformation. We're talking about the historical and intellectual path of Siddhartha Gautama, the man who, of course, became the Buddha. Now, the sources we've got for this deep dive, they really open an incredible window onto the 6th century BCE in the Indian subcontinent. We'll be exploring the political scene, which was vibrant, often pretty turbulent, actually, and the social and spiritual landscape, too. All the stuff that not only shaped Siddhartha's personal journey, but also created this fertile ground for one of humanity's most lasting philosophies. This isn't just a story, right? It's looking at how truly radical new ideas can actually take root and flourish under specific historical conditions.
Exactly. And our mission today really is to unearth the crucial insights about Siddhartha's life. His groundbreaking perspectives and the maybe surprising context in which Buddhism first popped up. What we hope you'll really get is that it wasn't simply the birth of, like, a new set of beliefs. It was fundamentally an intellectual revolution, a massive paradigm shift in how people understood suffering, existence itself, and importantly, the path to human liberation. We're going to peel back the layers and look at how and why this huge movement got started.
Absolutely. And the narrative arc we're following is pretty remarkable. You've got this prince isolated in just unbelievable luxury, seemingly destined for world power. Then he becomes this intense spiritual seeker, pushing human endurance to its absolute limits. And finally, he becomes the awakened one, the Buddha, whose teachings just reshaped thought for literally millennia. It's a journey of self-discovery that I think still really resonates today.
Okay, let's unpack this. So let's really try and paint a picture here. Imagine the Indian subcontinent, maybe around the 6th century BCE. When we look at the historical records, you really need to forget any idea of a single, massive empire controlling everything. The reality was, well, much more complex. It was dynamic, sometimes quite turbulent, actually, like a tapestry woven from lots of small, independent kingdoms. And these self-governing city-states, they were called Yanapatata, plus various tribal federations, too. It was less a unified nation, more a kind of mosaic of competing powers, shifting alliances, different cultural identities evolving all the time.
And if you wanted to find the sort of the heart of all this political and social action, the historical accounts consistently point towards the middle and eastern bits of the Ganj Valley. That's modern Bihar and Uttar Pradesh, basically. This area was super dynamic, densely populated. It had 16 major janapadas, often called the Mahajanapadas, the great kingdoms. Some names that keep coming up in the sources are powerful places like Magadala, Kusala, Vatsa, Anga, and crucially for our story, the Sakya clan. These weren't just isolated pockets. They were interconnected, always vying for resources, for trade routes, for influence. It created a very fluid, sometimes volatile environment.
Yeah, and what's really striking is how Siddhartha Gautama's own origin is just completely tangled up in this fragmented political reality. He wasn't born in the middle of some grand empire that dictated everything. No, his birthplace, Kapilavastu, was a small principality, semi-autonomous, belonging to that Sakya clan you just mentioned.
Right.
And while it was strategically allied with the bigger, more influential Kosala kingdom, which was pretty common, smaller states needing protection, the Sakyas themselves had a really unique government structure for the time. It wasn't your standard monarchy, one king with all the power. The historical record suggests they ran it more like an oligarchical republic.
Interesting. Like a council making decisions.
Yeah, exactly. They had a Raja, the sort of figurehead king. But the big decisions, especially about war, peace, internal stuff, they were actually made by a council. Maybe elders, maybe elected reps from the ruling families. It points to something more deliberative, maybe even proto-democratic in their local setup, which is quite something for that era. This whole decentralized, often competitive environment with all these little powers jostling for influence. It actually fostered something really crucial for new ideas to spread, which was, well, a limited degree of social mobility and, critically, space for intellectual ferment. Things weren't totally rigid. It allowed new ideas, even really radical ones, to kind of circulate and take root more easily than they might have in some huge, oppressive empire that could just squash dissent.
So the fragmentation actually helped.
Paradoxically, yes. It created this incredibly fertile ground for questioning the status quo, for debates, and ultimately for totally new philosophies like Siddhartha's to emerge. It was a landscape just ripe for innovation precisely because it lacked that single suffocating central authority telling everyone what to think or believe. It really offered these pockets of intellectual freedom.
That political scene sounds like a really fascinating backdrop, almost like an open stage for new thinking. But, if the politics were fragmented, our sources constantly stress that the social structure was the complete opposite. It was solid. India back then was built on this immovable foundation, the Varna system, the caste system. And this wasn't just like a loose set of social classes. No, it was the absolute core organizing principle of society. It rigidly divided people into four main classes. Each had its own designated roles, responsibilities, and really importantly, its own inherent level of purity. So right at the top, you had the Brahmanas. They were the priests, the spiritual teachers, the intellectuals. They held immense spiritual and scholarly authority. Sacred texts, rituals, philosophy, that was their domain. Below them, the Kshatriyas, the warriors, the rulers. This was Siddhartha Gautama's class, actually. They wielded worldly power, protection, governance.
Right, the administrators and the military arm.
Exactly. Then came the Vaishyas, merchants, farmers, skilled artisans, basically the economic engine of society. And then at the bottom of this hierarchy were the Shudras, the laborers, the servants, doing essential but often tough jobs for the other classes. Service was their main role. And then, our sources mention, there were people who existed completely outside even these four main categories, often doing the most, demeaning tasks. The untouchables. Their very presence was thought to be polluting by the upper castes. It condemned them to a life of really severe marginalization and ritual exclusion. Just awful.
This really brings up a key question, doesn't it? If Siddhartha Gautama was a Kshatriya, from that powerful warrior ruler class, privileged, why was he looking for a spiritual path that meant giving it all up?
Yeah, seems counterintuitive.
Well, the answer seems to lie in that specific dynamic between the Kshatriyas and the Brahmanas, the ones who dominated the spiritual scene. Kshatriyas had worldly power, armies, right? But the Brahmanas held the supreme religious authority. They had this near-total monopoly on the sacred Vedic texts. These were passed down orally, guarded really fiercely. They claimed the exclusive right to perform these incredibly complex, elaborate sacrificial rituals, the yajnas. These were believed to keep cosmic order, bring prosperity, even ensure the state's welfare.
So they were essential intermediaries.
Totally essential. Plus, they claimed to have a direct line to the gods. They were the gatekeepers for spiritual truth and salvation, effectively. And the social impact of that was huge. It meant most people were religiously passive, completely dependent on the Brahmanas for their spiritual well-being. They couldn't access the sacred knowledge themselves, couldn't do the complex rites. Their spiritual fate was seen as being handled by the priestly class.
Creates a real power imbalance.
A massive one. And this situation, this spiritual dependence, the tight control over religious knowledge, it didn't sit right with everyone. It actually sparked this surge in alternative spiritual quests, especially among the more thoughtful, perhaps more questioning, members of the Kshatriya class. They were rulers, protectors, but spiritually. They were second fiddle to the Brahmanas. This imbalance, combined with maybe a deep thirst for understanding beyond just ritual and birth status, seems to be exactly why we see so many influential spiritual figures like the Buddha and Mahavira, who founded Jainism, coming from this very Kshatriya background. They weren't just questioning the social order. They were fundamentally questioning the nature of spiritual authority, inherited privilege, and what the true path to liberation actually was. They wanted something more direct, more experiential.
That context gives such a vivid picture of the internal dynamics within India at the time. But it's truly remarkable when you zoom out and look at the 6th century BCE globally, not just in India. Our sources consistently point this out. It was like a global era of profound spiritual and philosophical awakening, almost simultaneous.
It's uncanny, isn't it?
It really is. It feels like humanity across different continents kind of hit a similar stage of societal complexity. Maybe urbanization, more trade, social stratification, things that just triggered deep questions about existence, ethics, meaning, questions the old ways couldn't fully answer anymore. I mean, think about it. While Siddhartha is on his quest in India, what's happening elsewhere? You got giants like Confucius and Laozi shaping moral and mystical thought in China.
Right.
You've got Zoroaster in ancient Persia laying groundwork for a new kind of ethical monotheism. And in Greece, the pre-Socratic philosophers are starting to question the nature of reality using rational inquiry. It's this incredible synchronized moment in intellectual history, a shared human quest for understanding.
Truly a pivotal era.
And specifically back in India, this intellectual and spiritual ferment led to two really significant movements that directly challenged the dominant Brahmanical orthodoxy. First, there was the Sramana movement. Now, these were really diverse groups of ascetic philosophers, people who consciously ditched conventional society. They often renounced everything, possessions, social ties. They'd retreat to forests, caves, or just wander as homeless beggars, all dedicated to lives of extreme renunciation, self-discipline, pursuing individual liberation, or ultimate truth.
So very different from the Brahmanical focus on community ritual.
Exactly. It was about intense personal spiritual effort, direct experience. And it's crucial to remember, Siddhartha himself came out of this tradition. In his early seeking years, he was a Sramana. Then the second major movement, often seen as developing alongside this, was Jainism. It was systematized by Mahavira. Jainism was, and still is, based on this incredibly rigorous philosophy of absolute nonviolence, ahimsa, applied to everything, even tiny insects, plants. It pushed for really strict asceticism, severe fasting, self-denial. The belief was in purifying and saving the soul through hardcore discipline and harmlessness.
These offered radically different paths compared to the ritualistic caste-based Brahmanism.
Right.
And here's where it gets really interesting, connecting Siddhartha's early path to these movements. The accounts suggest that in his initial searching phase, Siddhartha was deep in the Sramana world. At one point, his practices were apparently quite similar to Mahavira's methods, very austere.
So he learned from others first.
Oh, yes. He diligently sought out famous teachers like Alara Kalama Udaka Ramaputta. He mastered their meditation techniques, yogic concentration, even reached profound trance states. He really committed to the ascetic lifestyle, the discipline, the austerity. He seemed to believe, like many Sramanas, that conquering the body was the way to transcend suffering. He pushed himself right to the edge. Reports say he survived on almost nothing, maybe a single grain of rice a day sometimes. Extreme emaciation, physical agony.
Wow, that's intense dedication.
It is.
Yeah.
But this is precisely where he made his truly radical break. His unique contribution starts here. Despite all that effort, the near-death stuff, he had this critical realization. Extreme asceticism did not lead to the ultimate truth or liberation he was seeking. He found that torturing the body just created another kind of suffering. It was another extreme, and it clouded his mind rather than clarifying it.
So it backfired.
In a way, yes. His decision to ditch radical asceticism, to start eating properly again, that was revolutionary. It went against the grain of prevailing Sramana practice, where extreme self-denial was often seen as the peak of spiritual achievement. It was an act of profound independent thinking, rejecting a widely accepted sacred path. This decision, to find what he later called the middle way, avoiding both indulgence and extreme austerity, that really marks the start of his unique contribution. It set him apart.
Okay, so with that rich historical and intellectual scene set, let's dive into the personal story of Siddhartha Gautama himself, born around, 563 BCE.
Roughly, yeah, that's the traditional date.
And his birth wasn't just recorded as a historical fact, it was surrounded by this sense of cosmological significance. Myths, prophecies pointing to an extraordinary destiny. There's the famous legend about his mother, Queen Maya. She had this incredibly vivid dream.
The white elephant dream.
Exactly. A magnificent white elephant holding a white lotus in its trunk enters her side. This wasn't just interpreted as a strange dream. It was seen as a powerful omen, symbolizing his pure, extraordinary nature, marking him as someone truly special, destined for greatness. And then after his birth, a seer comes along with a prophecy that basically dictates the course of Siddhartha's early life. The seer says the young prince faces this fork in the road. Either he becomes a great universal king, a Chakravartin, ruling huge lands with justice and power, or he becomes a great spiritual teacher, a Buddha, who would guide humanity away from suffering, a monumental choice.
And you can imagine how his father, King Suddhodana, reacted to that.
Right. He desperately wanted the king option. Secure the kingdom's future, not have his son wander off on some spiritual quest, abandoning his duties.
So he took pretty drastic measures, quite extraordinary, really. He decided to basically isolate Siddhartha completely within the palace grounds, built him 3 separate palaces for different seasons, shielded him from any hint of suffering, imperfection, the harsh realities outside.
Created a bubble.
A total bubble. Surrounded him with every luxury imaginable. Beautiful gardens, exquisite music, constant dancing, beautiful women for company, the finest foods, just endless entertainment and pleasure. The goal was crystal clear. Create this perfect artificial reality,
a world of blissful ignorance where Siddhartha would never encounter old age, sickness, or death, keep him tied to worldly pleasures so he wouldn't fulfill the spiritual side of the prophecy.
Wow, talk about helicopter parenting, ancient style.
Right, and think about the psychological impact. Siddhartha essentially grew up in a gilded cage, completely cut off. He had zero direct concept of aging, illness, death, hardship. His reality was just perpetual youth, health, pleasure. It created this profound naivete, a complete lack of understanding of the human condition beyond comfort and sensory pleasure.
Which, ironically,
Exactly. The irony is huge, because when he finally did encounter suffering, it hit him like a ton of bricks. It was utterly transformative, precisely because he'd been so meticulously sheltered. His father's plan, trying to control destiny, inadvertently set the perfect stage for the very awakening he wanted to prevent, made the eventual confrontation with reality so much more potent.
and that shattering moment did indeed arrive. Around age 29, the sources say. Despite his father's best efforts, Siddhartha managed to venture outside the city walls. Maybe on some carefully arranged trips, but still, he got out. And it's during these outings he sees what are famously called the four sights.
The game changers.
Totally. First, he sees an old man, frail, stooped, struggling with age, a shocking contrast to the eternal youth he knew. Then a sick man, ravaged by disease, in pain, totally dependent. Next, he sees a dead body, lifeless, decaying, being carried off for cremation. A chilling smack of mortality's finality.
Imagine seeing those for the first time at age 29.
Unbelievable. And then the fourth sight was completely different. An ascetic monk. Calm, serene, composed, even though he looked poor and austere, radiating this deep inner peace.
The impact of these sights was immediate and just profound. The first three, old age, sickness, death, they just ripped away the veil. They showed him the inescapable truths. Impermanence, suffering, decay are part of all existence.
Yep.
He realized with this gut-wrenching clarity that no amount of luxury or power could shield him or anyone from this. It wasn't just observing, it was like experiencing it raw for the first time. It triggered a total, irreversible mental revolution inside him.
The bubble burst.
Completely. The
Yeah.
artificial palace life just crumbled. He felt this overwhelming urgency to understand suffering and find a way beyond it. But that fourth sight, the monk, that offered a crucial alternative. It wasn't just doom and gloom.
A glimmer of hope.
Exactly. While the first three revealed the problem, the monk hinted at a solution, a path to liberation, to inner peace amidst the chaos of impermanence. Seeing the serenity sparked this deep, burning desire in him for something similar. So, driven by this realization, this overwhelming need to find a real solution to suffering, Siddhartha makes the massive decision known as the Great Renunciation.
Leaving it all behind.
Everything. He deliberately chose to walk away from his luxurious life, his royal status, his wealth, his beloved wife Yashodhara, even his newborn son Rahula. This wasn't just packing a bag. It was an act of incredible courage, conviction, radical self-sacrifice. A complete break from societal expectations, personal ties, worldly ambitions, all in pursuit of a deeper ultimate truth. It really shows his total commitment to the quest.
So Siddhartha steps out of that gilded cage, leaves literally everything behind, and just throws himself into years of intense spiritual searching, asceticism. Our sources say he went deep into the forests, seeking out wisdom from the big-name spiritual teachers and ascetics of the day. He diligently learned meditation, yogic techniques, explored the existing paths to insight. He wasn't just wandering. He was actively, rigorously engaging with the spiritual landscape, soaking up everything he could.
He was a serious student.
Absolutely. But he didn't stop there. He seemed to think that extreme physical discipline might be the key, so he took his ascetic practices to the absolute limit. Self-mortification that just pushed human endurance to the brink. We hear these accounts of him surviving on almost nothing, maybe that single grain of rice a day, like we mentioned, pushing himself close to death.
Yeah, the descriptions are harrowing. Body withered, emaciated, skeletal.
He truly believed, it seems, that by conquering his physical self, pushing his body to the limit, he'd unlock those profound spiritual truths he was after.
Which was a common idea among many Sramanas then, right?
Yeah.
That extreme austerity purified the soul, led to liberation.
Right.
But here's that critical realization again. The turning point that really defined his whole philosophy and set him apart. Despite all the suffering, the near-death stuff, the intense discipline, he realized these extreme methods did not work. They didn't lead to the truth he sought.
Just more suffering.
Exactly. He found that starving and torturing his body just led to physical weakness, mental fog, and actually perpetuated a different kind of suffering. He realized these extremes weren't the path. They were just another form of attachment to the idea of self-punishment. His decision to abandon this radical path, to resume normal, moderate eating, what he later called the middle way, that was truly revolutionary for the time.
Going against the accepted wisdom.
Completely. It was an act of profound independent thought, rejecting this widely accepted, deeply respected, sacred path that many saw as the only way. This moment of clarity wasn't just personal, it was a huge philosophical breakthrough. And the immediate fallout really shows how deeply ingrained extreme asceticism was back then. Our sources say that even the 5 monks who'd been following him, copying his severe practices, they just abandoned him.
Wow, really? Why?
They saw his decision to eat and recover not as wisdom, but as a betrayal, a weakening of resolve, a failure to endure. They thought he'd given up on the true spiritual quest.
That must have been tough.
Absolutely. Being rejected right at that vulnerable point. It highlights Siddhartha's incredible conviction in his new insight. His realization that true liberation wasn't in extreme self-denial, but in a balanced approach, nourishing body and mind to allow for clearer insight. He was truly charting a new course, even when it meant going it alone.
Which brings us right to the climax of this whole arduous journey, the moment that just echoes through history. The awakening under the Bodhi tree. Around 528 BCE, estimates suggest.
That's the traditional timeline, yes.
So after being abandoned by his buddies and having found his middle way, Siddhartha makes this really decisive, profound move. He sits down under a large fig tree near Gaya, the place we now call Bodh Gaya, a major pilgrimage site. And he makes this unbreakable vow. He would not get up from that spot, wouldn't move until he uncovered the ultimate truth, until he reached complete enlightenment.
Total commitment, all in.
Totally. For 7 days and nights, the texts say, he engaged in this period of intense introspection, cultivating profound mental clarity. This wasn't just chilling under a tree. It was an active, deep dive into reality's nature, the mind's workings. He confronted inner distractions, fears, desires, all the mental static. Legends even describe him facing temptations and illusions sent by Mara, like a Buddhist tempter figure trying to break his concentration, pull him off the path.
The final hurdles.
Right, but through sheer unwavering resolve and insight, he overcame all of it. Internal, external obstacles, gone.
And during that process, those 7 days and nights under the Bodhi tree, he gained the core insights of his enlightenment. It was called Bodhi. He reached this profound understanding of karma and the cycle of rebirth, samsara, that continuous loop of existence driven by actions and consequences. And crucially, his take on karma was less about divine judgment, more about natural cause and effect, focusing on intention behind actions.
Okay.
He pinpointed the root cause of suffering, identified it as craving, attachment, and ignorance, our clinging to things that are impermanent, our basic misunderstanding of reality's true nature. Critically, he grasped the cessation of suffering, a state he called nirvana, which isn't annihilation or some heaven, but a complete release from craving, aversion, delusion, perfect peace, liberation achievable in this life.
That's a key point.
Absolutely. And finally, very practically, he understood the path to achieve this cessation, the Eightfold Path, a comprehensive practical guide. Ethical conduct, mental discipline, wisdom, designed to lead you step by step towards liberation.
And right at that pivotal moment, having achieved this profound, revolutionary understanding, Siddhartha Gautama becomes Buddha.
The awakened one, the enlightened one.
Yeah, no longer just a prince or a seeker or an ascetic. He was someone who had fully realized the nature of reality, transcended the ordinary human condition.
And our sources tell us, interestingly, that right after enlightenment, the Buddha hesitated. He actually paused before deciding to share this profound truth.
Why?
He genuinely feared it was too deep, too abstract, too subtle for ordinary people, caught up in worldly concerns and conventional thinking. Would they even grasp it? He wondered if his revelation, so radical in its simplicity, might just be misunderstood or dismissed as crazy talk. It shows his concern about accessibility.
Makes sense.
But ultimately, driven by immense compassion, a central theme in his teaching, he decided to teach. And guess who he chose as his very first audience?
The 5 monks who ditched him.
Exactly. His former companions, now hanging out in Sarnath. That act itself shows such deep understanding. He knew they were serious seekers, and he wanted to gently guide them to a path that actually worked, despite their earlier rejection. It really showcases his compassion and his unwavering commitment to sharing the wisdom, starting with those who had already walked a tough spiritual road with him. #3. The birth and proliferation of the Dharma.
So after this incredible personal awakening and that moment of hesitation, the Buddha decides, right, let's set the wheel of Dharma in motion. Let's share this. And setting for his very first public teaching, what's often called the first turning of the wheel of Dharma, was the deer park in Sarnath. just outside Varanasi.
Yeah, truly seminal moment.
Absolutely. This was when his teachings started to spread, not just as his personal insights, but as a coherent, actionable system for others, a path to liberation open to everyone. And in that foundational sermon, he laid out the core principles that became the bedrock of Buddhism. He introduced the Four Noble Truths. Elegant in their simplicity, right? They concisely lay out 1, the reality of suffering, dukkha. 2, its origin, craving, and attachment. 3, its cessation, nirvana. And 4, the path to its cessation.
The diagnosis, the cause, the cure, and the prescription.
Perfect analogy. He also clearly articulated the concept of the middle way. That practical stance avoiding extremes, no excessive indulgence, but no debilitating self-torture either. Balance and moderation are the effective route to insight. And central to that middle way was the Eightfold Path, that practical guide covering everything from understanding and thought.
Right, understanding very
to speech, action, livelihood.
Right speech, right action, right livelihood.
All the way to effort, mindfulness, and concentration.
Right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. Yeah.
And these weren't presented as like rigid commandments, but as this integrated, progressive path for inner transformation.
The significance of this event is just huge. It's widely seen as the very moment Buddhism was born as its own distinct philosophical and spiritual tradition. Separate from the Sramana movements it grew out of, and fundamentally different from Brahmanism, it was the first public layout of the Dharma, the truth he'd found, structured and accessible.
And the immediate result.
Equally significant, those 5 monks who abandoned him, they became his first disciples. They accepted his teachings, experienced their power. Their conversion marked the founding of the Sangha, the community of monks and later nuns too. And this wasn't just a fan club, it was the start of an organized movement, a living body dedicated to preserving, transmitting, and living these teachings.
So what does this all mean for where this new philosophy was headed?
It means it now had a vessel, a dedicated group of practitioners committed to carrying it forward, in word and deed. That ensured its survival and its eventual spread.
Okay, so from that first sermon in Sarnath, the Buddha then embarks on this really extraordinary period. Just relentless travel and tireless teaching. Our sources say for the next 45 years, basically until he died around 483 BCE, he was constantly on the move, just traversing the Ganges basin back and forth.
Non-stop, really.
Yeah, he didn't just set up shop somewhere and stay put. He actively took his message to the people, adapting his teachings for all the different audiences he met. His influence spread across huge regions, powerful kingdoms like Kosala, the rising empire of Magadha, even more republican areas like Vaji. He covered a lot of ground. And his impact wasn't just limited to one social class, which was pretty radical in caste-bound India, right?
Very radical.
He connected with ordinary people, farmers, merchants, laborers, gave them practical wisdom for dealing with their daily struggles, no matter their social rank. But he also deeply influenced the elites, the rulers. We know he got significant support, patronage, from the kings of Magadha, first King Bimbisara, then later his son Ajatashatru.
That royal support was absolutely critical.
Also.
Well, it gave his nascent community, the Sangha, a level of legitimacy, protection, and importantly, resources. It allowed them to flourish, build monasteries, expand their reach without being immediately shut down. It showed his message, this radical path open to all, regardless of caste, could actually gain acceptance even at the highest levels of power. That was huge.
Right. It gave it staying power.
Exactly. And it's really important to reflect on what Buddhism was during this long period of active teaching. The sources consistently emphasize it wasn't initially this rigid, systematized religion, not like we might think today with fixed dogmas or written scripture.
More fluid.
Much more fluid. There was no established canon yet, no set scripture, no central authority besides the Buddha himself, and maybe the evolving consensus within the Sangha. It's often described as a living search, an evolving experience of personal awakening, a continuous process of teaching, dialogue, sharing insights. The Buddha was known for tailoring his teachings, responding to specific questions, specific suffering, unique circumstances, using relevant parables and analogies. It was dynamic, organic, focused on direct experience and practice, not rigid doctrine.
That makes sense, given his own journey.
Precisely. And this dynamic, experiential nature is just perfectly captured in his powerful final words. Before he died, as recorded in the sources, as he lay dying, surrounded by his disciples, he didn't appoint a successor. He didn't lay down unchangeable rules. Instead, he empowered his followers with this profound message of self-reliance, personal responsibility for liberation.
What did he say again?
Famously, all conditioned things are subject to decay. Strive on with diligence for your own salvation. Or another common translation, everything is impermanent. Achieve your salvation through your own effort. These words just hammer home the core principle. True liberation isn't about relying on a god or priests or even the Buddha himself after he's gone. It's about understanding impermanence and putting in the effort yourself through wisdom, ethical conduct, mental discipline.
Wow.
It was a profound call for internal transformation and personal agency, not just following rules or passive belief, a truly enduring legacy of individual empowerment.
Yeah.
So, just to kind of wrap this up, that whole period, roughly 563 to 483 BCE, Siddhartha's lifespan, it represents so much more than just the start of a major world religion. Our sources really stress it as this multi-layered historical event. It was, like we've discussed, an intellectual revolution, fundamentally challenging the prevailing ideas about suffering, the self, the path of freedom.
Right.
It was also a profound social inquiry, questioning the rigid caste system, offering a spiritual path open to anyone, regardless of birth.
That was huge.
And maybe most importantly, it was a radical ethical transformation. It laid down this moral framework centered on compassion, nonviolence, mindfulness, self-awareness,
Yeah.
ideas that still resonate powerfully across cultures today.
Absolutely. And Buddhism, as it came out of this, tumultuous but fertile time, it wasn't born as some static, finished belief system handed down. It really was, as the sources nicely put it, a living search, dynamic, evolving through personal awakening, continuous teaching, and inquiry.
No rigid dogmas, no scriptures right at the beginning. It just blossomed organically through lived experience and shared wisdom.
It truly stands as one of humanity's great intellectual journeys, delving into those core questions: suffering, meaning, freedom, offering a perspective that shaped billions of lives.
So, as you, our listeners, reflect on this deep dive into Siddhartha's life and the world he navigated, maybe consider this final thought. It's a bit provocative, perhaps. In our world today, just saturated with information, constant external influences, so many voices telling us what to believe, how to live, what we should want, what does the Buddha's emphasis on achieving your own salvation through your own effort truly mean for us now, in our own personal quests for well-being, for understanding?
That is a profound question to chew on, a really good one. We definitely encourage you to reflect on that, and as always, to continue your own deep dives into knowledge and maybe self-discovery too. Until next time, keep exploring.